Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Simon Fowler, CEO of Empowering People Group, and I'm delighted to be hosting this session this morning. Before we get started, here's just a quick overview of who we are and why we're here today. EPG consists of 4 really innovative, tech-led companies that are on a mission to simplify employee experiences and empower people to drive business success. And today, our mission is to simplify the complexity of some of the topics that are making the headlines at the moment. Before we start, just a quick piece of housekeeping before we get into the session, and then a little bit more about what you can see in front of you at the moment. The screen is customizable, so you can drag and move the speaker and slide views to position how you prefer. You'll also find speaker bios listed in the panel next to these. We've included some resources on the topics being discussed, which you can download during the session and which we'll also send to you after the webinar. Lastly, you can see a Contact Us button, so you can get in contact with us at any time. If you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A comment box at the bottom of the screen. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can towards the end of the session, but if we don't get to them all, we'll follow up with answers after the session. I'm also joined today by Halborns Managing Director, Rena Christou, to share her extensive employment law expertise and use her unerring ability to convert complicated legal speak to easily understood business speak. Rena, say hello.
Thanks, Simon, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm delighted to welcome Rob Darby, founder and CEO of 200 Degrees, personal favourite of mine. So Rob, you set out on a quest to create the perfect cup of coffee and now have over 20 independent coffee shops nationally and a roast house to achieve that perfect cup. Rob was also one of the first entrepreneurs I know to pick up on Labour's proposals. So I've invited him along today to share his thoughts on what they might mean for businesses. So Rob, over to you to say hi.
Yeah, thanks ever so much for inviting me to join you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great stuff, thanks Rob. It's been a really busy year so far in the world of employment law, with new laws coming in thick and fast and more landing later this year. With the local elections giving us a really strong indication of a new Labour government on the horizon, it looks like there'll be a whole host more changes too. Labour recently announced its Green Paper, which comprises a wide range of employment law changes within the first 100 days of coming into power. Businesses will need to get up to speed really quickly with the proposed changes. So with our usual solutions-focused, proactive approach, and always with the aim of simplifying HR, we're here to help you prepare early for the impact of these possible changes, summarising them for your key stakeholders and to help shape your people agenda in readiness. As a massive thank you for you joining us and spending your valuable time here, we'll also be providing a checklist to all attendees that you're able to work through in your own time, along with a board summary document which you can share internally to help cascade the information from today's session to your key stakeholders, so they're also clear on the likely changes landing if Labour win the general election. We'll share a little bit more on how to access these at the end of the session. So, between the three of us, we're going to try and give you a clear and concise summary of the need-to-know detail and the practical impact of the changes that you're all set for, the changes which may follow. There's a lot for us to get through, so let's get going. Rena, before we get into the main bulk of this session, do you want to give us a quick headline summary of what changes are being proposed at the moment?
Of course. So at a high level, the key changes they're proposing, which will likely have the most impact, and that you might have seen in the press in terms of headlines, are making unfair dismissal a day one right, introducing personal liability for directors of companies who break the law or fail to comply with tribunal orders, a new right to disconnect, so switch off from work so that employees aren't contacted outside of their usual working hours, ban on 0 hours contracts, and then eradicating qualifying periods for things like sick pay and parental leave, and introducing a genuine living wage for all.
So not much happening then. That's a lot of potential changes on the horizon. And I think what we'll do, if it's okay with everyone, is let's just tackle each of them in turn, kicking off with making unfair dismissal a day one right. So what will that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, so this one is making quite the headlines at the moment. So presently, under current law, employees need 2 years service in order to bring an ordinary unfair dismissal claim. And what Labour is proposing to do is reduce this. So although there's a lot of focus on this becoming a day one right, it's actually a little bit misleading. So what they've actually said is that it's subject to contractual probationary periods. So what that will mean is that employees who pass their probationary period will achieve the right to bring an unfair dismissal claim after they've passed that probationary period that's set out in their employment contract. So what we might see as a knock-on effect of that is that this may result in businesses introducing longer probationary periods or continually extending the probationary period to eke out the period where the employee is not protected and is not able to bring that unfair dismissal claim. But it also could discourage some employers from taking on new workers altogether, so perhaps putting up with underperformers or even encouraging them to offer more self-employed contracts. So we might see more of that in practice. Now, I see a number of challenges with this practically. So firstly, employment contracts aren't always drafted well enough to ensure that it's clear what the probationary period even is, whether there's the right to extend it. So actually, the starting point for employers will have to be a review of employment contracts, and in particular around that probationary period wording. So we'd suggest bumping this to the top of your to-do list as a priority, because the reality is that it will only affect future hires. So getting good, clear clauses in place now is key so that you're not trying to negotiate that at a later date. And then if I had a pound for the number of times I've had clients tell me that their managers have forgotten to do the probationary review or failed to note that they have, what that looks like, I'd probably be on a beach somewhere right now, to be honest. So that creates a big issue with proving at what point the employee's right to unfair dismissal kicks in. That diarying the key dates is really important. That will mean employers will have to have much better processes in place to ensure that probationary periods are not missed and that managers are trained to understand their importance. There's, of course, the importance of empowering your managers to proactively and confidently manage people issues after someone has passed probation too. So the work's not done just up to the point of probation periods. So, for example, do your managers have the tools and the confidence to drive performance? And do you have clear policies to back that up?
Yeah, sorry, I'm smiling, Rena, because this is a massive bugbear of mine and exactly what our Empower solution solves. It just feels like managers have so much on their plate at the moment, myself included, when it comes to people issues. And I think Gartner stated that 75% of business managers are totally overwhelmed by the growth of their job responsibilities, and 73% aren't equipped to lead organizational change. I think also in that same study, they found that 82% of the HR leaders interviewed said they didn't feel their managers are currently equipped to lead change. For me, it's like, how are they going to react and deal with the increased potential of grievances? And to be honest, I wouldn't know where to start. If somebody came to me today and started to talk about something they wanted to raise, I think, I can see where that 75% of managers who are overwhelmed by their responsibilities is. I think it's a really interesting few months and years ahead. Rob, what's your take on this?
Well, I think when I first read about this, I was a little bit concerned, because we all make hires which don't work out, and not necessarily because someone has fallen into a gross misconduct style of behaviour. Just perhaps the organisational and employee fit wasn't what we hoped for. It is best to be able to say thanks and this hasn't worked out without exposing yourself to headaches of unfair dismissal and the ongoing management of situations which become quite a distraction sometimes from running an organisation. But I think when you look at the point that Rena's just explained, where we'll still be able to use probationary periods effectively, we may increase some of the probationary periods that we perhaps use for some of the different roles we have within our organisation. I think that concern lessens massively. Well trained throughout the organisation, we need to manage people very clearly. And if we do make a hire that just doesn't fit, then we need to be able to say within the probationary period that it hasn't worked out. So, on reflection, reflection, I'm not overly concerned. I just think it heightens the need for everyone who has, reports to the organisation to really understand how to manage and develop and assess an individual within their probationary period, to make sure that they do fit in well with your organisation before you set them on and say, you've passed probationary and you're with us and welcome to the long term.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Rob. And I think it's going to be a really interesting time for empowering managers and making sure they're ready to do exactly that. So let's move on to another big headline which has been proposed, which is introducing personal liability for directors of companies who break the law, who fail to comply with tribunal orders. Rena, can you actually explain what that will mean in practice?
Yeah, really big statement, but actually there's very little detail proposed at the moment in terms of what that really means. So Labour's Green Paper makes clear that they want to introduce tougher penalties for those who break the law or fail to comply with tribunal orders. But at the moment, we don't know what they'll be personally liable for. So, is it just you've lost at employment tribunal, the company hasn't paid out and you'll be asked to kind of step in and foot the bill? Or is it actually, there's been underpayment of holiday pay and we're going to be turning to the directors to have to step in and sort that out in terms of personal liability? So the truth is it's unclear. But the one thing that we do know and that we should be looking at is getting ready for this potential change. And a key step of that is going to be reviewing your directors and officers' liability insurance. So if it doesn't currently cover employment tribunal awards, our suggestion would be look for one that does.
Brilliant, thank you. Great tip there, and I think one that the three of us will be watching with a lot of interest as it starts to mature. Thanks, Rena. So moving on to another big change, the right to disconnect and switch off from work. Interesting one. Rena, do you want to take us through what this was likely to mean in practice?
Yeah, sure. So this is really based around work-life balance. So the idea is that employees will have the right to switch off from work outside of the hours that they're contracted to work. And that literally means that as their employer, you cannot contact them outside of their working hours. So it sounds like a new concept in the UK, but actually it's already happening in other countries. So you might have heard that France has already got this in place as an example. And it'll be interesting to see how this will work in practice, as many in salaried roles have an obligation in their contracts to perform additional work outside of their usual hours. So just to get their work done, that's usual wording that we see in those contracts. And if there's an acquisition in particular, so a particular challenging period or a business opportunity to seize, that can obviously mean working around the clock to get it done. Again, how that then works in practice. So although Labour are talking about making the right to disconnect a legal requirement, the reality is that most employees now expect the right to disconnect anyway, and that this has meant employers have already had to embrace the concept. So although the headline is impressive, the reality is that many employers have already had to make this change anyway. That said, there is definitely an increasing trend towards working flexibly, and so it then becomes harder to identify what is working time, when the time to disconnect actually starts. And equally, with more senior roles, there's often a requirement to flex when there are work pressure points. So many senior individuals will probably accept this, but in the case of fallouts, which do occasionally occur, they may use this as a possible new law as an opportunity to case build against their employer. So again, something to watch out for. So in practice, I guess the tip to take away here is reviewing what you've got in your employment contracts and making sure that employers are going to have set out very clearly within their contracts what classifies as working time in the first place, how flexible hours operate, and then the times when extra work may be required, so that you're agreeing that from the get-go with those individuals.
Yeah, I agree, Rena. I mean, for me, it feels like it's going to be really difficult for some businesses. I mean, work-life balance has quite rightly become more important in the workplace over the last few years, and I think that's entirely correct. But as you say, there are always going to be those circumstances in some businesses or roles where employees do need to do some extra time outside of it, and may even do it without the employer's knowledge. So I think it's going to have to be really, really carefully managed if it actually comes into practice.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rena. So, working through the other key changes, introducing a ban on 0 hours contracts. Coming back to you, Rob, how do you think this might impact your business if it becomes law?
We haven't used 0 hours contracts for quite a number of years now. So I think within 200 degrees, this would make no difference. We have an environment where we can offer you a minimum number of hours, even if you're part-time, and we feel that that's the right thing to do. But I'd just add to that, generally, I think this is perhaps a bit of a worrying move, because there are organisations which use 0 hours contracts really effectively to the benefit of the employer and the employee. An events company would be a good example, where you have a bank on roll of trained personnel who you can call on, for the size and timing of the event, and that works really well for the employer who would struggle to give you regular hours, and the employee in that environment generally benefits from perhaps a top-up salary, or perhaps they're still at school or college and they can flex what they say yes to, perhaps according to exam season, for example. So I do worry for some employers that this might not be a great change, but for us, actually, it wouldn't be a concern.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And Rena, how can businesses who do rely, as Rob pointed out, who rely heavily on 0 hours contracts, how do they best prepare for a rapid change in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I think before I just jump into that, what I would say, there's been a leaked paper, which you may have spotted, or which our viewers may have spotted, that suggests that they might be watering this down slightly, and actually that they might allow employees and employers to agree whether to offer the 0 hours contracts. But watch this space. But regardless, I think, as you say, we need to be prepared, because we don't know which way they'll land if they are elected, in terms of getting ready for this rapid change. So Labour currently have made clear, in terms of what they have published, that they will ban 0 hours contracts, or contracts which don't offer a minimum number of guaranteed hours. So I think the reality is that we may see an increased number of employers offering guaranteed absolute minimum hours just to get around this. So, as little as an hour a week, or even an hour a month, in some of the kind of literature that we've seen. So they've tried to tackle that in their green paper by setting out that where individuals are working regular hours for 12 weeks or more, that those individuals on 0 hours contracts will gain a right to a regular contract to reflect those normal hours worked. So I suspect there'll be a process that needs to be followed in terms of putting that request in, and watch this space in terms of what that looks like. But it remains to be seen as to what will amount to regular hours in the first place over that 12-week period. And employers will want to look now at how they're resourced so that they're not heavily reliant on the same workers picking up any flexible hours that they have to offer. They may also want to consider whether they have the right systems in place to be able to regularly review the hours that are being worked by 0 hours workers, to spot when someone may be getting to the stage of performing those regular hours. And from a practical perspective, reviewing the use of 0 hours contracts across a business is a good habit anyway to get into, regardless of whether this becomes a legal requirement or not. So while 0 hours contracts do have some advantages that Rob's touched on already, they can also create challenges for businesses. The whole point of a 0 hours contract is you don't need to offer the hours, but equally the individual doesn't need to accept. So there are obviously operational difficulties in that respect. So supporting your managers to be able to identify how best to service work that is needed is a key starting point, so that the contracts issued genuinely reflect working practices and genuinely support your organisation. So, for example, if you're able to offer guaranteed hours, that could help in turn drive things like engagement and retention. So that would be the starting point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I take Rob's point, actually, that it's, and I think it feels like some legislation which it's there for the right reasons, but actually could end up really disadvantaging organisations that use 0 contract hours in the right way, and probably the ones that it's trying to focus on who perhaps don't use it in the right way will probably get around it the way they do now, and the way that you've kind of highlighted. So definitely another one to watch there. And finally, there were a few other key changes that you mentioned previously. Could you just summarise those for us, Rena?
Yeah, we'll do a whistle-stop tour of those as well. So other key changes which have been proposed are, and I think a really big one for me, is scrapping caps on compensation awards. So they're already uncapped for claims such as discrimination and whistleblowing. So it looks like this is going to be in relation to unfair dismissal claims. Now, the reality of that is that's going to have a huge impact on exits and settlement negotiations, making them much more difficult and, let's be honest, much more expensive for employers. So tying that in with the day one right for unfair dismissal that we talked about earlier, could see a very different landscape there in terms of those negotiations and what that looks like. That's a big one. The other one, which you may have spotted, is ethnic pay gap and disability pay gap reporting. Now, you might have spotted that in the news recently, and the idea is that it's to mirror the current gender pay gap reporting obligations that are already in place for large employers, so those with 250 employees or more. In short, it's likely ethnic pay gap reporting will be introduced at some point, as it's not a new concept. So previous governments have talked about this already. So our suggestion on this is do an initial review, get a first draft of your data now to the board before it becomes compulsory, before it becomes mandatory. So you've got long enough to influence the data and have the ability to avoid having to publish data which could be embarrassing. They gave us 18 months notice of bringing in gender pay gap reporting. So you'd like to think we'd have some similar timeframes in respect of any other reporting obligations that come in. But it takes a long time to influence that data as well. So although it sounds like a big lead up, it isn't necessarily. Next, as you can see on the slide, we've got eradicating qualifying periods for sick pay. So Labour is proposing to scrap the qualifying period, which currently relies on 3 waiting days before statutory sick pay kicks in. Again, this is likely to be a significant additional cost to employers and will make proactively managing sickness absence, let's be honest, much more important, including the infrequent one-off days. So a high priority for businesses, especially because they're proposing to increase the amount payable for statutory sick pay as well. So not only are you paying earlier, but you'll be paying more. And then in keeping with that proposing kind of scrapping of qualifying periods, they're also suggesting that parental leave, such as maternity, shared parental leave, etc., should also all become a day one right. So you don't need to wait to have the qualifying level of service currently needed in order for those to kick in.
Wow, yeah, I mean, I think your point about proactively managing sickness absences is so important for many reasons. I mean, we've seen incredible benefits delivered in terms of improved employee experience and significant cost savings through proactive sickness management, and I think that's only going to get better or worse depending on how you look at it. When managers are empowered to give the right support at the right time, our customers have seen up to a 10% reduction in sickness absence rates, which now is going to be even more impactful if qualifying periods are also removed. Rob, how do you think scrapping the qualifying period for SSP would make a difference to the sickness levels in your business?
I think inevitably it probably will, but I think I would echo what you've just been saying, because where we do see raised sickness levels in a particular site, obviously we run coffee shops at the moment, it almost always comes in line with some level of employee disengagement, discontent within the site, and ultimately poor management. And when we address those issues within a site and improve the way we are managing and engaging with the team there, then again you see the sickness levels drop again. So I think this will, it must have a cost. I'm sure it'll have a cost. But I think it will really, it just emphasises the need for managing, engaging and working with your teams really, really strongly. We all get sick, it happens, and, that's part of life. It's managing sickness to the point where people are off when they're genuinely sick and genuinely need to be off. And that only that happens fair and reasonably in well-run, well-engaged sites, and sometimes it happens less reasonably in sites where we're not working well with the team. So I think it just boils down to you need to do a really good job of your management, and then it'll limit any impact of this.
So in many ways, nothing's changed, Rob. Yeah, a great answer.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. So I think, it's pretty clear there is a lot to think about and plan for. And whilst we don't know what the outcome of a general election will be at this point and how much of these proposals will actually be progressed, it's best to start preparing for them early on and make sure you have the systems, processes and policies in place to be able to get ahead if they do come in. Because I think, as Rena said last time, we had 18 months for pay gap, and I think it would be fair to say there were still organisations that were scrambling around at the last minute to get it done. So I think start now and make life easy for yourselves. Rena and Rob, thank you so much for breaking it all down so clearly and sharing some really practical insights, which I think is key to the way we approach things and for our audience to really understand it from a business perspective. As we've been going through, we've actually had a few questions. So before we close off the session, if you don't mind, let's just tackle a few of those together. The first one is in relation to unfair dismissal being a day one right. Is there a time limit on how long you could make a probationary period? Rena, do you want to pick that one up for us?
Yeah, of course. So at present there isn't, but of course Labour could introduce a cap. So even if they don't, it's important to remember you've got to balance the length of a probationary period with your commercial and operational needs too. So let's be honest, having an extra long probationary period isn't going to entice the best talent. And also, in reality, it becomes really difficult to manage. So I suspect what we'll see is a move to a 6-month probationary period, whereas a lot of organisations currently have in place a 3-month probation period. And that will expect the right to extend by a further 6 months to become the norm to that. So that I think will be where we see as kind of industry standard moving forwards, if this is what comes in.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is about SSP changes. Can you change any contractual sick pay you currently offer if the cost of SSP increases and the qualifying period is scrapped? Rena, I think that's definitely an employment law query, so over to you on that one.
Yeah, the short answer is it really depends on what your employment contracts and policies currently say. So ultimately, if you're looking to take something away that you contractually currently offer, there are formal processes that you need to follow in order to do that. So you can't just remove them without following a process. But also remember that starting those processes at a later date is going to be more challenging, especially if you're doing it at the same time as unfair dismissal becoming a day one right, which we've talked about. So meaning more employees that present could challenge the changes that you're wanting to implement. So kind of getting in early before that comes in is really, really key. It's also worth reviewing your contracts and policies now to ensure that you have the flexibility you need built in readiness for this proposed change. So waiting until it actually becomes law will make negotiating any changes much more difficult with employees, no doubt defaulting back to whatever the legal position will be at that time. So yeah, as you said before, Simon, kind of kicking off sooner rather than later for sure.
Yeah, definitely, that makes perfect sense. And so the third question, HR teams are being stretched. So with the potential for significantly more unfair dismissal claims being raised with the day one right, how do we prepare for the increase in workload? I think I'll take a quick go at that one, if you don't mind. I think as we touched on earlier, for us, management empowerment is a vital first step. And Rob, I think you mentioned it as well. Ensuring you have clear processes that managers can confidently and competently follow will reduce the risk of poor process management, contributing to more claims being upheld and more claims. With the burden of proof in unfair dismissal claims resting on the employers, ensuring consistent and fair processes are followed and can be evidenced will actually be even more important than I think it already is, and we find in working with our customers. Rob, is there anything you'd like to add on how your business will need to prepare?
I suppose I've been around long enough to see employment law change a lot. And I think the thing I've learned over the years is making sure that you review and look at your documents on a relatively regular basis with someone who can give you sound advice is definitely what we will need to do to make sure that we're always in line with the evolution of the rules. But it's all there to ensure that employer and employee behave fairly, and therefore I don't think this is anything to get overly stressed about. It's just to make sure that we're aware of the rules, and we do pass that down the chain to everyone within the organisation that is managing people, to make sure those individuals understand where their role extends and what they need to do in order to look after their team in a fair and appropriate way. And if we do all that, then I think all of these rule changes, there won't be a big headache. It's just another evolution in the way we're expected to do things. So we'll just make sure we communicate well within the team. I think is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, brilliant, Rob. Thank you. And I think that's so key, isn't it? It's really, things will change as they always change, but I think it's making sure that you support your managers and the people and your colleagues in your teams in the right way going forward. So that's brilliant. Thank you. We've also got a handful of further changes to come, as many of you will be aware, to come around sexual harassment and predictable working in the meantime, which have been promised by the current Conservative government. That also has a lot of complication around it, but don't worry, we'll be absolutely running some extra sessions nearer the time to talk about those in more detail, and in the same kind of aim to bring simplicity to complication. So watch this space. That brings us to a close. We seem to have had so many years without very much employment law change at all, and now it's all coming at once. We hope you found it a massively valuable session. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If we weren't able to cover off your questions, we'll follow up with you personally after the session. Rob, Rena, thank you both for your insight and practical guidance today. It's been really appreciated, and I'm sure by our audience, putting the business context into what is some complicated times ahead. As we touched on, these changes will require updates and amendments to your existing people documents and templates, as well as new documents to be introduced. At Empowering People Group is all about simple solutions to people challenges, so we're expertly placed to help ensure you implement these changes in the right way, in a compliant and consistent manner. If there's anything we can help with, please get in touch using the contact form available on your screen, and we'd be delighted to chat through the solutions we have to get you to where you want to be. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've also included a handful of free resources for you to download, document checklists so you can cross-check the actions you need to take to prepare for the possible changes needed, as well as a board summary note which can be shared with your key stakeholders, board of directors, so that you have a note on all of the employment law changes which are likely to follow if Labour comes into power. Well worth a look, and again, download from the resources sections on the screen. So it just remains for me to say a massive thank you for everyone who joined us today. I hope you've got a load of value from this. We look forward to seeing you all on another Empowering People Group webinar in the very near future.